Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Everything worked perfectly last night, of course, and here we are. So I hope we don't give you any sonic booms again, but it could happen, so buckle in. Thank you very much for coming this morning. And I know everyone has conflicts in their schedule, and have family outings and picnics and everything to attend, so I sure appreciate you all coming. And let me tell you a little history here. The Arlington Common really started less than 2 years ago, and a small nonprofit group organized themselves of about five people and bought this complex from the Catholic Church. This was the old Catholic Church, built in 1964, but it included the rectory building next door, and then there's a parish hall behind us, which we use as a health center, and then of course the garage. So we have all grandiose plans for all these buildings coming up, but our feature is creativity, community, wellness, and really this can serve lots of different, it's a venue to serve a lot of different functions here at this complex. Just to show you, here is a picture of Bill Bullock signing our final agreement, and as you can see, it's November 2nd, 21, and it was less than 2 years. And believe me, with just our own donations, grants, gifts, that sort of thing, we've had to do a lot to these buildings. Everything's under construction. Our plan is to build new walls out here with grant money, plus donations and gifts. I think we should add a sound system in here too. This is what it looked like just 2 years ago. And you can see the building on the left is the rectory next door. It's shrouded, you could hardly see the building. And the first thing we did was cut down the trees. We began to clean it up. We hosed out the inside, repainted. The church, of course, really doesn't appear to have much change to it. The parish hall behind us has served as a fitness center, and it's really wonderful. Every day you see lots of cars in this area, and they're doing all kinds of fitness, yoga, bone building, and so forth. And then the famous garage that someday hopefully will be we'll turn that into some sort of a barbecue pit. You can see right away we got into it, began to clean it. Now since this picture, of course, we've taken off the aluminum siding, and you can see we've exposed the wonderful shake shingles, but we've also exposed a lot of problems with the house, and so we're working on it. Our architectural scheme is to make the building look like that, and we're currently looking at contractors to build a new porch and repair the shingles on the side. We also have a grant to replace these opaque windows that you see here with an insulated window. So we have lots going on, and in the back of the building, this is what our plan is. This is what it should look like in a few years. Our board currently looks like this. Carol Farley's our president, and she's around. Bibi Bullock and Bill Bullock sitting back there. Ned Reed is a trustee, and he's got some wonderful art that he's brought with us today. Sue Harder, Joyce Kennedy, and myself. And really kind of sad because the theme this year was going to be all about Buddy. But I must say that his beautiful wife, Dorothy, passed away two days ago, on Wednesday, 3 days ago. So we're very, very sad. Wonderful couple who grew up in this town and just contributed so much, to our program. So about 13 years ago, we got started over across the street at the Episcopal Church. This was our 2010 gathering, and you can see we have We had approximately 20 models at that time. And it really was a prompting of Buddy Edgerton, who's in the back row. And Buddy and I kept talking about, hey, maybe we should do a reunion. And we did that year, and it was quite successful. We had a lot of fun. And then we decided every other year we'd do the same thing. And so this was our 2010. 2 years later, we went up to the Sugar Shack just north of town here, gathered again, and the new owner gave us a beautiful turkey dinner, and we were all on board having a good time. It was a great camaraderie of the Arlington models, and I think so it's become a tradition. Then in 2014, we went to the Bennington Museum. And the Bennington Museum hosted us and did a wonderful job of setting up the program. They didn't have as much problem with their speaker system as we did this morning, but it's a good thing. And then in 2016, we really had a terrific reunion, and this is at Norman Rockwell's house in West Arlington. The dedication was to the historic sign. And just a quick note that we thought, what are we going to do at this event in 2016? And I said, gee, why don't we put up a historic sign? And when you do that, you have to send in an application. So I sent a note up to Montpelier, and I said, we're thinking of doing a Norman Rockwell historic sign. And the guy said, great. He said, write down 120 words and send it in to me. 120 words to describe Norman Rockwell. How would you do that? Well, I pieced together 120 words approximately. I got it back in about an hour, all scribbled up, and he changed things around. And it went through a few iterations, but basically then I had to go to Montpelier and talk to the people up there about making the application. Do we really need a Norman Rockwell historic sign? And there are about 14 people in the room, and these are all advisors appointed by the governor. And they said, you mean we don't have a historic sign for Norman Rockwell? No. So it was a no-brainer. But this was a wonderful event that we had in 2016. Then in 2018, we did a joint model reunion, and this is with Stockbridge in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and it was great. And we celebrated both the Norman's studio on the left in West Arlington, and then his studio in Stockbridge at the museum. And that again was a wonderful event. It just meant that lots of models and lots of people had to get down there. Well, then we came to 2020. And everything stopped abruptly. So that was the year that of course, we wanted to, in that year, I remember Buddy was going to celebrate his 90th birthday. And I kept thinking, that's going to be great. We're going to have a big birthday cake and all this stuff in March of 2020. Well, of course, it never happened. That didn't leave Buddy out of the loop. He continued to talk on the phone all the time, and I'm sure you've all talked to Buddy endlessly. He just loved to be on the phone, loved to talk to his models and anyone who wanted to talk about Norman. It also gave me pause to think about what are we here in Arlington, and I just want to divert a little bit. It was not just Norman Rockwell who lived here during this period of time in the early 40s and in the 50s. These other artists all lived in the town at the same time. And so in addition to Norman, of course, there's Gene Pelham, and you're going to hear more about Gene. Terrific artist. John Atherton, one of the top still life artists that I can even think of. Of course, George Hughes, a tremendous contributor to the Saturday Evening Post. Mead Schaefer. All of these men contributed to the Saturday Evening Post covers and inside editions, and that's just the Saturday Evening Post. That's not other journals and magazines and calendars and so forth. In all, you can see the numbers. This is what was done between 1939 and 1953. It was quite a haven for these Arlington artists. Just astounding. And if you can imagine, how would you like to be the artist that lives in the shadow of Norman Rockwell? And these men did. That's how good they were. They were extraordinary artists. One of the controversies that came up out of artwork out of Arlington, of course, is breaking home ties. This was the last post cover that was started in Arlington, and it was completed in Stockbridge. This created a controversy about 18 years ago, and my dad copied that painting, so you can guess which is which here. But I'll give you a hint. The one on the right, my dad did. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is this gentleman is named John Sandon, and John went to the museum in Stockbridge because I inadvertently hung my dad's painting in the museum. And there it is. John immediately walked in and said, "That is a replica. Why are you hanging a replica?" And you could see he wasn't very happy here. And so he then wrote letters and so forth to the museum, and very nice, but he was adamant, and he was the first one who pointed out the errors of the replica. Since then, John has written me. I've talked to him about what we're doing here in Arlington, and John wrote this note to me, and I've got to read it to you. "Your great project is stimulating the outline of an illustrated lecture entitled The Arlington Artists 1939 to 54 and Their Contribution to American Life." Now listen, my thesis is that there have been other artist groups which, while historically important, had only localized effect on the nation's culture. Number one, the New York 10 under Child Hassan. Number two, the Boston School under Yves Gamal. Number three, the Brandywine School under Howard Pyle and the Wyeths. Those are tremendous family and local groups that were famous for art. He says, but the Arlington artists, because of their contribution to World War II effort, had a national and even international impact, the Four Freedoms, etc. That's a very powerful statement, and it stimulated us to think about our community, and it's not just Norman. And here's John, and his credentials were fabulous, and you can see his portraits. He was an unbelievable portrait artist, and you can see some of his work on display here. Now, I must say, unfortunately, John passed away on Christmas Eve, this past Christmas. And his last piece of artwork was the tomb of Jesus. And that portrait, or that masterpiece, is now in the Billy Graham Museum in North Carolina. And it's blown up to about the size of one of those large windows. But that's how powerful he was. He was all in for our project here in Arlington. So, a lot of criticism comes about illustrators, and they say, oh, they're just illustrators, they're not real painters. But keep in mind, these people had editors, and they had to deal with the editors, and they had to be under their foot all the time. They had to meet their deadlines, and you can see the frustration of trying to meet the deadline, but wanting to do their own artwork. But what did they do? They captured the culture. They captured the change of our community. This is one of the gentlemen, Mead Schaefer, tremendous artist, and he was one of the best friends of Norman while he lived up here. Just an illustration of what happened. These pictures in the top row are typical illustrations of what Norman did. What Mead did during the war years. And he's illustrated that. Now, abruptly, post-war, all of a sudden, you see, we're dancing, we're in church, we're maple sugaring. It illustrates the time. That's what I think is featured by these illustrators. So if anyone walks up to you and said, well, Norman, Mead, all these guys were just illustrators, this is a tremendous feat. They've captured the history of our time and our culture. Now, here's a Mead Schaefer post cover, and you can see this is Earl Labatt. Is Earl here today? I think he was supposed to. But this is over at the Ice Pond Farm in East Arlington, and just to give you an example that we used other models, so it wasn't all Norman, it was other illustrators used the same models. And here's George Hughes, tremendous, had an extraordinary run with the Saturday Evening Post. Here's an illustrator. His daughter Jenny is sitting in the lap, and that was done by Norman. So the point is, it's a mix and match of models and illustrators in the town. Here's Jenny on the left, and my dad is on the right, and that's a model for Casey Jones for Reader's Digest. Now, again, here's George. On the left, he used Buddy Edgerton, and in the Edgerton family, they call that Bud the Stud. And on the right is another illustration with Stan Grover and Bobby Cameron, and I was hoping that they would appear today, but that was illustrated at the gas station right down the road here. And then, of course, we come to Norman and his studio in West Arlington. What I think the great quotes from Norman are, it was like living in another world, a more honest one somehow. So when Norman moved from New Rochelle, New York to Arlington, or West Arlington, this is what he felt. And I think this impacted and made his art so great. He said if Harvey McKee, a local farmer, was taken sick, Jim Edgerton, Jim's grandfather, would do his milking. He said, I met 100 or 200 people I wanted to paint. Ideas were jumping in my brain like trout on the Battenkill at sunset. So it was just such a tremendous revival for Norman. One of the great influences for Norman Rockwell is this man, Thomas Fogarty. And Thomas was an art instructor in New York at the, and what he instructed Norman to do is he said, Norman, step over the frame, Norman, over the frame and live in the picture. Well, he did. He loved it. This was just his cup of tea. And you can see he would not only do this for the models, but when he went down to sell his post cover, he also would do the same thing in front of the editor. And he would describe it by going through kind of theatrics, if you will. But that's what made him so great, is that he had the idea and he could illustrate it, but it was in his brain so he could make that come alive. Now, I love it when people criticize Norman about he's just an illustrator, he should have done this, should have done that. But Norman makes no secret about it. He wrote a book called How I Make a Picture. And number one in the chapter is getting the idea. Once he has the idea, his number two thing is how to select the model. That's how important the models were. So quite often he would be in town and maybe see a redhead or someone with freckles or pigtails or whatever. He knew what he needed and he observed. That was his most important, second most important part of making a picture and turning it into a final cover. Then he, of course, had the importance of the detail, live in the picture. Poses and props is making the charcoal, and then making the color sketch, and then the final painting. Every painting that you see of Norman Rockwell's, there are probably 7, 8, 9, 10 pictures behind it. And that would be the charcoals, that would be the idea sketches, the charcoals, the color sketches, and then the final painting. And sometimes the final painting wasn't final. It went to the trash can, and it was burned in a barrel next to the Edgerton farm, if you can imagine. And I think I wish Buddy had snaked some of those out before they got ignited. But anyway, it's a real process. And of course, now we come down to the models themselves. The models can make you or break you. And here's a great example. You're going to see lots of examples today. We also got paid $5. And this is 1951. And just to give you an idea, you may say, well, $5, what's that? Well, in those days, gas was 20 cents a gallon, bread was 16 cents a loaf, milk 92 cents. So it was a pretty significant amount of money for a model, especially me, who was probably 5 years old. And then, of course, we come to our friend Buddy. So I have a little video here that I'd like to show you.
But I've always gone by the name Buddy, since my dad was a James too. I'm 83 years old. For the better part of my life, I thought about telling folks about my childhood, but wasn't sure it was right to tell people who I know. We Vermonters are inclined to be private folks. But times change. Turns out this old dog can learn a new trick or two. I decided to take a stab at it. I can't promise it'll be perfect, but I can promise I will honor the truth the best I remember. I'm pretty good at the details. Probably could talk for hours about it, but I'll try to keep it simple, just like I grew up. Green mountains, swimming pools, church suppers, all leading up to a place my sisters and I call home. I can't think of a grander view on the valley. Looking down on our dairy farm that barely kept us alive during the Depression. I was told I was born on the living room table of our 1812 colony. It still lies just to the left after you cross the old covered bridge. Lots of folks looking in on our town wouldn't believe it. That growing up was just like living in a Norman Rockwell painting. But that's just how it happened, or close enough to it, I suppose. And you can take my word for it. Or you can ask the man whose studio was just a stone path away from our back porch. Our neighbor, Norman.
So, what I want to do now is introduce you to Jim Edgerton Jr. and Jeff Culkin with some words. And I tell you, Jim, I think, is our youngest Arlington model. So we're going to stay as young as you. So come on up, Jim.
Hello, everybody. It was great seeing that video because my son, Mac, who's now 30, helped produce that when he was working for Quixotic Endeavors in New York City. So Mac had a hand in that video, which was very nice. But before I get started, I want to thank Don and every person that has contributed to making the Commons happen. You know, my father, Don, and many others feel that, you know, while Stockbridge has a great museum and has, you know, their claim to Norman, we always know that Norman's best work was done here in Arlington. And the fact that we can have an official place in this town to honor Norman, I think, is a great thing. And hopefully we can continue to make it better. And I know that my father made sure that he told me before he passed away that I needed to make a donation to the Common, and I will. So Don just mentioned I was born on May 12th, 1955, which puts me at 68. And unless somebody can prove me wrong, I'm the youngest Vermont model on the planet. You know, when we did our models reunions, we've had a lot of models here, and of course every 2 years we would lose models along the way. You know, my father was called Buddy because in the video you heard him say it, because his father was a James II, right? So I escaped the young Buddy name. Most people call me Jim. My girlfriends call me Jimmy. And a lot of my friends, like Jeff who's going to be up here, and co-workers called me Edgy. But I was thinking when I was putting this together, my great uncle Ken Wilcox, who owned the lumber mill down in West Arlington Valley on 313, when I used to go into his house, he used to say, "There's young Bug." And I thought he was saying young bug, like B-U-G. And now I was thinking maybe he was saying that I was young Bud. But anyway, I was very young at that time. So my father loved the state of Vermont. All parts of it. And when he was with the Extension Service, he ran half the state from north to south. So from the Canadian border all the way down to Bennington County. He really loved the town of Arlington. And they really loved the Route 313 Valley. And I can remember the hundreds of times that he and I would drive down to camp or whatever. When we were going down the Dugway, we would, look up to Benedict Hollow and see where we were hunting and all that kind of stuff on the way down. But most importantly, my father loved the green. It wasn't until he drove through that covered bridge where the church and the schoolhouse and the Grange Hall were, and the two houses, the Rockwell and Edgerton house, that he felt home. That's when he felt at home. And he would tell my sister that, and he would tell me that. When my grandmother passed away, my father's sisters got some of the property. My father got most of the acreage, but a lot of it was woodland. And for years, we didn't really do much with it because my father was living in Woodstock at the time. And then he would move to Burlington. But in 1982, I was working at a college in Wisconsin then called Beloit. And in 1982, Scott Finney and my father, along with Dave Berry and Bob Straffolino, built a rudimentary structure on the property we called Camp James. But it was, I think you could have lived in a tent and it would have been warmer and more productive. But in any event, in 1983, when I came back from Wisconsin, my friends, my father and his friends, we turned that camp into something that's very special today. My father couldn't throw anything away, and the first camp structure that we tried to deal with, we had no propane lights, so we had the Coleman lantern. And my father would invariably, hit his head on the lantern. It would hit the floor. We thought the camp was going to burn down. And of course, he had to use an old wood stove from the farm that the flue was stuck shut. And Jeff knows this because he's hunted in our camp, but that thing would smoke up the camp, and it was just not all that great. But we turned that into a fun place to be. It exists today, but I wanted to shout out some of my father's very good friends that were very much a part of that camp and who were residents here in West Arlington. Lyle Salter, who owned the IGA in East Arlington. Leo Budrow. John Page. Stan Smith Jr. Tom Greenwood. Bill Bowen. Bob Stroffolino. And Dave Berry. And Dave Berry actually passed away at our camp during hunting season. And that was in 2013. And my father would then invite friends of his. And I am going to throw a few names out. One is Dick Culkin, and you'll hear from Jeff momentarily. Stan Webster and Art Robert. And these were people in many cases that my father met at cardiac rehab in Burlington. And they would start talking about hunting, and he couldn't wait to invite them down. So my father used to say that their farmhouse was 14 rooms in a path. Not 14 rooms in a bath, 14 rooms in a path. And the path was to the outhouse or to, the pump so they could bring water in. And it's hard to believe, but the farmhouse, my parents' or grandparents' farmhouse didn't get electricity until 1936. So my father never saw, a bathroom until 1936 other than the outhouse. So in 1943, Norman and Mary moved next to my grandparents' house, and they knew each other. Both my grandfather and grandmother had been painted by Norman prior to that. And 10 years later, when Norman was forced to move to Stockbridge, he said this, in quote, he said, "When I finally moved away, the thing I regret the most was leaving Jim and Clara." And I wonder, how did they become such good friends, right? My grandfather went to school through the 8th grade and then took over the farm. And Norman was a famous artist and traveler around the world. And Mary went to Stanford. And my grandmother was raising children at 16. And yet, they had an extremely close relationship. And it led to the Edgertons being a 4-generation modeling family. And we never thought much of it. My great-grandmother was in going and coming. And then both grandparents were painted. I had 3 aunts that were painted, and then myself, which made the 4th generation. And when my father wrote his book, someone asked the question, and no one could answer it. It was, are there any other 4-generation modeling families on the planet? So I called the museum and spoke with one of their folks, and they said, I don't know, let me get back to you. And when they did, they said, yes, there is one. And it's Norman, his family. So that's pretty good company to keep. So the first illustration my father was in was I Will Do My Best when he was 13 years old. And then he did these other ones. Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. Show the back end of a cow on a calendar that people had to look at it for 12 months. And Norman said it was the worst illustration he ever did, worst idea he ever had. And my father claims it was one of the most fun modeling experiences because he said he had Norman for about 2 hours, showing him how to milk a cow and do all this kind of stuff. My father was also in Men of Tomorrow with Peter Rockwell, The Shadow of Lincoln, where there were 5 Edgertons in that one painting. The Vet, he played a new Cornell graduate, veterinary medicine. A Guiding Hand with Tommy Rockwell. And Growth of a Leader, the one that I was in when I was 9 years old. Now, my father's dogs were also used in these paintings, and just like Don showed before, my father got $5 every single time one of his dogs was used in a painting. And one of Norman's students was Don Spaulding, and Don Spaulding had a contract with Dell comic book covers, and my father was in 16 Lone Ranger covers. And we'll see some of those pictures coming up shortly. So who was James Buddy Edgerton, Dad? He was a smart person, he was a quiet person, and he had, at a very young age, he had to assume big responsibilities on the farm. He was the only boy. And even Dad said to me, he said, you had to really grow up fast when you were in that situation. Dad was a good, kind person. Everyone liked my father, and I can't remember any time that he said anything negative about anybody. I think if he felt that way, he just didn't say it. And he was a good student. He was a captain of the Arlington baseball and basketball teams up the road. And as a parent, my father was very present, certainly in my life. He coached Little League. He coached the Little League Pirates up the road here in Arlington with Arnold Wilcox. And when we finally moved to Woodstock, he coached the Babe Ruth team there. And when I was at UVM and playing baseball at UVM, he attended almost all the games if they were, within striking distance. We hunted and we fished a lot. And we did this together. I mean, we spent hours upon hours upon hours together doing those things that we liked and involving our friends. And, working on Camp James. So simply, I would say that my father was a very kind and loving person. He was always willing to help. And a funny story, some number of years ago, he got a vanity license plate. Budo, B-U-D-O-T, a play on Bud and Dot, my mother. And my mother hated that vanity plate. I mean, she scolded him like you wouldn't believe. And after about 2 years of him tolerating this, he said he couldn't take it anymore, so he got rid of it. But his nickname, my father's nickname today, of anyone that comes to camp is Budo. We call him Budo, and it's stuck. Kind of interesting. So my father's ashes are currently resting at my sister's house in an urn that's a tapped maple. It was fitting for my father being, a sugar maker, that his ashes be there. And soon, sometime this fall, my sister and I are going to come down with some people. We're going to spread some of those ashes up on the property. And eventually, my mother's ashes and my father's will be placed in the cemetery in West Arlington. And we always knew, or my father always knew, that Norman never really wanted to leave West Arlington because he had a funeral plot, a cemetery plot in that West Arlington cemetery. And on the day he left in 1953, he deeded that cemetery lot to my father. So Dad always says that the historians are going to get all screwed up when they look at the Edgerton plot and they see some cornerstones with ours on them. So anyway, to conclude, my father is sorely missed by friends, family, and me. But despite being gone, his memory will certainly live long in this valley, and the relationship with the Rockwell family and other models will live on forever. Thanks. So Jeff's going to come up next, but before Jeff comes up, Don had put together a few slides, and I thought I would just comment on them briefly. So this is obviously the area that my father loved most in Vermont. As soon as he came across that bridge, this is what he liked the most. On the left, my grandfather and grandmother were posing for I think it was a holiday card. And I believe it was in the summertime, and yet they pulled out the sleigh. And my grandmother shot this 8-pointer, and you saw in one of the earlier slides that Don put up, Norman bought this deer and mounted the head in it, hung in his studio until he left in 1953. And it wasn't, well, my father doesn't know where that deer head went. It could have gone in the landfill. But my grandfather shot a 10-pointer that hung up in our camp forever, and I've since given it to the inn so that they can put it in the same spot because it looks almost the same as my grandmother's deer. And my grandmother could out-hunt and out-fish most men that I know. So this is my father and his 3 sisters next to the old schoolhouse. And over to the right, you can see my Aunt Artis on the left, my Aunt Joy on the right, and I believe Aunt Edith is in there somewhere. My grandfather on the top, my grandmother driving the doodlebug. And who is it, Art? Who was the pilot that got shot down? Yeah, Art Becktoff is the gentleman in the front. He would show up and help my grandfather on the farm, and he ended up being shot down over Germany after like 18 missions, and he was rescued or liberated, and one of the people on that liberating team was Bob Straffolino, of all people. And when Art came back, my grandfather recommended that he be the model for Back to Cities. Here's my father next to the Edgerton house, and you can see that the house needed a lot of work. And when Norman moved next door, Norman would not paint his house until my grandfather could paint his. So it kind of gave you an indication that Norman wasn't there to show anybody up. He was a good neighbor. And that's one picture of my father with Mrs. O'Leary's cow, showing Norman how it's done. This was I will do my best when Dad was 13. I never knew how Norman got the rope exactly right in this picture until we see the black and white. That's how he did it. And in Men of Tomorrow, my father is actually every one of those models in Men of Tomorrow. He just changed the face a little bit with all the other ones. And there's Norman with the prop of Men of Tomorrow. So my father did 16 of these covers for Don Spaulding, and Dad claims that the only one where the Lone Ranger is smiling is the one on the left, and he said all the other 15 were, you know, knife fights, gun fights, people scowling at one another, and they thought they needed to change that up a little bit, so they did this one. This is the long shadow of Lincoln with 5 Edgertons in this one. And this is the one I snuck into when I was 9 years old. And I like to say that I started my fraudulent life right here because I was not a Cub Scout. I had to borrow this uniform from Peter Hirsch. And my father was not a scout either, even though he was painted more as a scout by Norman than anybody. And here, this is a painting called the United Nations. You can see Don must have done that little arrow showing my father. This eventually became a golden rule, or the golden rule, it kind of morphed. And this is the helmet that is in that picture. And Norman couldn't just get a helmet, he had to take it and beat it with whatever, shoot it or whatever to make it look original, because that's the way he was. And I'm donating this to Don and the Commons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Don. I originally met Bud in, of all places, a ballroom dance class in 1982. I was there with my fiance. We were trying to polish our ballroom dancing skills for our upcoming wedding. And Jim, I still don't know why Bud was there. I think Dot may have cajoled him or dragged him by the collar to get him there. But I met Bud in the winter of 1982. I met Jim shortly after that. We worked together and then were subsequently business partners in a company called SimQuest for many years. And that was the beginning of a deep, deep 40-year friendship with my family, the Culkin family, and the Edgertons. I always referred to Bud as one of the last true Vermonters. And when you think of it, he grew up in the West Arlington dairy farm, attended the University of Vermont, had a long career with the UVM Extension Service, starting off as a county agent and worked with the 4-H programs. He had a sugaring operation. Jim and I, one rainy day, cold rainy day, helped him plant 450 Christmas trees for his Christmas tree plantation that he later sold, and he certainly enjoyed many hours on his Kubota tractor. So I always refer to Bud as one of the last true Vermonters. Bud told me that it was the act of him leaving the West Arlington farm and to attend the University of Vermont at the encouragement of Mary Rockwell was the inspiration for Norman to create Breaking Home Ties. I am certainly no art critic, but personally I consider Breaking Home Ties, Shuffleton's Barbershop, which later became Lyle and Ruth Salter's IGA in East Arlington, and the homecoming with the Marine from Benedict's Garage, and there's still the Gulf sign out on Route 313 in front of the garage, to be his finest works from the Arlington era. There are many parallels between Bud's life and my father, Dick. They were dear friends for over 35 years. At my father's retirement in 1988, he was described two ways. He was described as a gentleman and a gentle man. And there's certainly those words apply to Buddy. At first glance, they would appear to be interchangeable, but they're really not. Bud Edgerton was a gentleman and a gentle man. Bud and Dot attended my parents' 50th wedding anniversary in Syracuse, spent many days turkey hunting, deer hunting at Camp James, and then Bud would come to Syracuse and fish at our camp on Oneida Lake north of Syracuse. My children are now 37 and 34, but they have many memories of every visit to the Edgerton household to play with Molly the dog would include vanilla ice cream and Edgerton Vermont maple syrup. I remember Bud for his generosity, for his desire to share the West Arlington property. He hosted several chicken barbecues back in the 90s, and many of you were probably there. Jim and I recently had a conversation, and we both agreed Bud did not hand out compliments readily or easily. He was reserved. But when he gave you a compliment, it was sincere and he truly meant it. Conversely, and Jim alluded to this earlier, he rarely, if ever, said a bad word about anyone. And the only thing I can really remember, we had a work crew many years ago, and one fellow wasn't quite holding up his end of the bargain. And Bud said, "I'm not saying that guy moves too slow, but if they were going to hang me in the morning, I'd send him to get the rope." I consider the 40 years and the friendships forged with Buddy and Jim at Camp James to be one of the great privileges of my life. When my mother passed in 2015, Buddy used a phrase, and it seems self-evident now, but I hadn't heard it at the time. Bud said to me, "It was an honor to know her." And it's certainly appropriate to Bud Edgerton, the last of the true Vermonters. It was an honor to know him. Thank you.
Okay, next, I'm really thrilled that Martin Mahoney, the director of the Bennington Museum, will say some words and has some slides. There's a long story, we'll do it later, but I've known Martin almost 20 years, or well, not quite, but a long time, and it's a great story. But without further ado, I'd like Martin to step up and give us some words about his view. By the way, he worked at the Stockbridge Norman Rockwell Museum all this time. So he is one of the authorities. Here you go. Thank you. And then if you want to advance the slides right here, I don't know what happened to your introduction.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today. Yes, I did work for the other home of Norman Rockwell, the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge for a long time. But I am really honored to be here today, be here in Arlington. I'm going to talk a little bit about Norman Rockwell, why he came to Arlington, some of the work, some of his changes that happened when he was in Arlington, and why he left. So, as Don said, I am the executive director of the Bennington Museum, which is right there. And I've been at the Bennington Museum for the last 2 years, coming out of the pandemic. It's been wonderful. I love coming back to Vermont. It's been an experience, and I really do appreciate the opportunity. Before that, as Don mentioned, I worked at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And there, I was in charge of the traveling exhibitions. So I took Norman Rockwell's artwork and other illustrators to 47 states and 7 countries during my 15 plus years working there. Really amazing experience. I've stared at a lot of the models about this far away in the paintings for hours at a time, sometimes in places that you wouldn't believe. Norman Rockwell in Rome, for example. And before that, I worked at the Peabody Essex Museum, which is in Salem, Massachusetts. I'm a graduate of Castleton State. It was Castleton State College when I went. I believe it's Vermont University now. I also have an MA from SUNY Albany, an MBA from MCLA, and attended the Getty Institute. That's just to reassure you that I kind of know what I'm talking about, but much like Rockwell, I never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. That's an actual quote. So who was Norman Rockwell? Well, as Don mentioned, he was an illustrator. And what's an illustrator? Simply put, they're an artist that gets paid. So Rockwell would work on commissions. He would work on anything from Maxwell House Coffee to Cream of Kentucky Bourbon to the Saturday Evening Post to Look Magazine. He had an assignment. And Rockwell used to say, the story is the first thing and the last thing. And that's the most important thing. If he couldn't portray a story in an image, he'd failed. He lived through the sweep of the 20th century. So think about that. When he was born, trains were the means of transportation. That was high technology. He saw the rise of flight. He saw man walk on the moon. He saw the civil rights movement. He saw 2 world wars. And he was actually a veteran as well. He served in the Battle of Long Island Sound, as he said, in World War I. He was stationed in Long Island. Born in New York City, had a really thick New York accent. If you hear him, or some of you who knew him, it was unmistakable. And his early education was at the National Academy of Design and the Arts Students League. He was brilliant at a young age. 14 years old was already recognized as a talent, a singular talent. And while he was at the Arts Students League, remember, in his teens, he had 2 teachers that really formed his artistic base. And those, of course, were George Bridgman and Thomas Fogarty. George Bridgman literally wrote the book on anatomical figure drawing. And it's true, you can still pick up his books in bookstores today. And this really shows him Rockwell's ability to render things that are very hard to do, hands and feet. If you look at his hands and his feet in his paintings, you can tell that those are a working man's hands, that's a lawyer, those are boots that have been used, and as you said, he beat the heck out of all of his props and really rendered authenticity to his work. Now Fogarty, on the other hand, was a bit more whimsical and really helped Rockwell, as you said, step out of the canvas and draw from life, draw a little bit of joy. And that certainly fed into what he produced here in Arlington. So of course, Rockwell had a very strong early career. 19 years old, Norman Rockwell was the art editor for Boys Life magazine. 19 years old. 19 years old, I was trying to figure out, how to buy beer in Rutland, Vermont. A few years later, he has his first Saturday Evening Post cover in 1916. And we talked about how he likes to use models. Well, those three young gentlemen, are all the same child. He went on to produce 323 Saturday Evening Post covers, but this was his first. And at the time, the Saturday Evening Post was the pinnacle of American illustration. So he literally was like a rock star at the time, especially by the time he got to Arlington. So while at the Post, he was doing images like this, kind of whimsical, everyday scenes of everyday life. And relatable, something that you and I can relate to instantly. And it's humorous, it's funny, it makes sense, it tells a story. It's a little bit, even when he was painting it, this was considered a little bit old-fashioned, but it was really, really effective at really, telling a story and bringing people together. And this was a piece for Country Gentlemen. So you notice the two country boys are the ones that have the giant fish, and the city slicker is the one that has the tiny little one. Norman came back to this theme again. He was a little bit self-conscious because he considered himself a nerd and not as athletic as even his brother, but he would always poke fun at himself. And that sense of humor served him well. So he decided at the time, after living in New York City, in New Rochelle, for a while, and really, really experiencing like the go-go 20s. He'd been married once already. He went on a trip to Europe. He came back. His wife was gone. He thought that wasn't a good indication of the health of the marriage, so they got divorced. He met his second wife, Mary, and fell in love while he was out in California. They had 3 children, and he was really starting to think, where am I going to go? Where do I feel safe? Where am I going to be able to raise the kids? Where's Mary going to be happy? So he decided to come to Arlington. And this is just a slide of the cast of characters. So of course we have Norman, we have Mary, and the ubiquitous dog. He seemed to have a real love affair with dogs. Ones he owned and ones he rented. And the 3 children, Jarvis, Peter, and Tom. And these are pictures of Rockwell in his Arlington studio, second Arlington studio. And why did he come to Arlington? I mean, I grew up in the Adirondacks. I come from a town of 1,200 people, and Arlington looks big compared to that. But why is this person? It'd be like having Harrison Ford all of a sudden move next door to me. Why did he come to Arlington? It was out in the middle of nowhere. Well, a few reasons. He was exhausted from the New York City lifestyle. At the time he was judging Miss America pageants, believe it or not. He was running around, living the artist lifestyle. He had his 3 kids to think about. Where's the best place to raise them? Rockwell's friends were really pushing the virtues of Vermont. Fred Hildebrandt, who had a lifetime love affair with fishing, who was an illustrator and a Rockwell model, kept on saying, Battenkill has the best trout fishing in New England, and it does. Norman, honestly, probably could care less, but he loved the idea of being outdoors. His good friend, Meade Schaefer, was already living in Arlington with his wife, Elizabeth, and all of this just started coming to a head. So he said, aha, I'm gonna take a trip up. I'm gonna go to Bennington, and I'm gonna take a look around Bennington with my wife and see if we could find anything. They went to Bennington, they looked around, and honestly, and you can read this in his book, My Adventures as an Illustrator, and some of the biographies, he hated it. He said, it's too much like the city, people are too gossipy, just did not like it. His real estate agent said, well, let's go up to Arlington, let's go up and see your friend. He did, he fell in love instantly. And literally decided to buy a house within months of seeing this area. Painting by Mead Schaefer, the Count of Monte Cristo. Mead Schaefer, as we know, is an amazing artist, highly regarded in his own right. And could you imagine, like Don said, living in the shadow of Norman Rockwell, you know, and happy with it. So one of the pieces that he first did when he was kind of transitioning to Arlington was Artist Facing a Blank Canvas, and done in 1938, finished in 39. I think it's a good example of the indecision that he's feeling. He's moving, all of a sudden it's hitting him. He's like, I'm moving from New Rochelle, New York, a stone's throw away from Times Square to Arlington. And the kids were getting a little anxious. Mary was getting a little anxious. So this may show a little bit of anxiety in, you know, what's next. This would also be a theme that he played with time and time again. But settling in. So Rockwell settles in and really, really starts to hit his stride. He had a few setbacks. Of course, in the early 1940s, his studio burned down. That was a little negative, but on the positive side, that caused him to move out to West Arlington. And he starts really refining his trade. And you see Rockwell start to fill in the background of these Saturday Evening Post paintings now. So before, you remember it was just two figures, maybe an armchair and a white background. And his art editors at the time said, Norman, you've got all the space, start filling it in. People want to see the detail. They want to see what you can do, because they knew, in the words of one of the former employees at the Norman Rockwell Museum, he could really push paint around. They wanted to see that. So he did. So he's living in Arlington, he's producing amazing pieces, and drumbeat of war is kind of coming up from Europe. The rise of Nazism, war breaks out. Rockwell is inspired, and he's inspired to produce some of the most iconic paintings in relation to World War II seen today. He was inspired by Franklin Roosevelt's For Freedom speech. He produced the following 4 paintings, and I know I don't have to bring them up, but I love them and they're awesome, so we're going to look at them. So, Freedom of Speech. This is an amazing piece. Drawn from life. Rockwell's using photographs and models extensively. We talked about the hands. Notice the hands of the gentleman gripping the pew much like this one. A few illustration tricks. Everyone's looking up. He's really focusing on the ears. The ears are a little bit oversized on the models, so everyone's very aware that you're supposed to listen and stand up. Freedom from Fear. Freedom from Fear is an amazing piece because it's quiet, it's subtle, and it just shows how lucky we as Americans were in 1941, 42, 43, and 44 and 45, because we didn't have war, for the most part, hitting our shores. That newspaper is a copy of the Bennington Banner that he did use. And it's really subtle. It says we should take, solace in that we live far from the war. Freedom of Worship, completely different composition, but how do you paint freedom from worship? And this was one of the ones that he had the hardest time with. Well, you put him sideways. You paint people of different creeds, races, religions, and ages. And you just emphasize that really, really simple freedom. We can pick which God we want to worship. We can pick where to go. It's amazing painting. But perhaps the most iconic is Freedom from Want. Now, Freedom from Want is as Rockwell said, features the only model that they went out and ate later, which was the turkey. But besides the turkey, that table is really sparse, and he did that on purpose. And he did that on purpose to show people in Europe that Americans weren't living high on the hog. We weren't rolling in wealth, and we weren't taking for granted their sacrifices on their home fronts. So this piece, besides the turkey, you have some grapes and some celery, and happy Thanksgiving, folks. This piece has been parodied time and time again, and it doesn't really relate to Arlington, but I just brought up a few parodies just for giggles. Tony Bennett used it for an album cover. Barbie used it for a comic book cover. And then the far painting is a New Yorker scene after 9/11. So this motif, time and time again, when Rockwell gets riffed on, he, much like any others, would borrow. As Picasso said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And Rockwell had no problem doing that. He produced this other piece, direct piece during World War II. Completely different piece, and I would say not as effective because Rockwell's forte wasn't war scenes. It wasn't something really strong and masculine like this. It looks like a war poster, but it's not as iconic as the Four Freedoms. It doesn't evoke emotion. Nice piece, though. And then he produced one of the most iconic paintings of all time, Rosie the Riveter. Now, you all have seen this painting, but if you've seen it in real life, it's enormous. It's got to be, what, 5.5, 6 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide, and it is amazing. And you see him starting to fill in the background. You see him starting to put detail in there that just kind of triggers an emotional response. The halo above her head, the arms on her, the war pins, and, most telling, her stomping on a copy of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. Really not being subtle, Norman, but really getting the point across. Amazing piece, amazing piece. This is held in the collection of the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, AKA the Walmart Museum. So Norman comes out of World War II, he's bigger than life, more popular than ever, and is producing paintings all around. Some of these paintings are out of order. This one we've talked about, Breaking Home Ties. The reason I know Don is because I was in California putting up another Rockwell illustration show, and the curator of the museum calls me at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which was 3 a.m. in California, and she says, "Martin, you've got to come back to Stockbridge." And I'm like, "Well, I'm going to be here in 2 days." "No, you have to go now. They found a painting in a wall. I don't know what to do." So, long story short, I got to know Don really well. It was fantastic, and probably one of the most exciting experiences you could ever have as an art historian. Rockwell also produced Saying Grace at this time. Ran over to Rensselaer, took a picture of the train yard. That's in the background. Probably one of the most effective paintings that Rockwell ever did, talking about evoking emotion, respect. I have been in the Norman Rockwell Museum and I have seen people weep in front of this painting, time and time again. And it's not just this painting, it happens all the time with Rockwell's images. Talk about all-time classics, Shuffleton's Barbershop. There's the photo reference in the corner. Really amazing painting. You've got the War Bonds poster in the background. You've got the comic books in the foreground. The comic books are so accurately done, the comic book collectors know which copy of X-Men that is. It's amazing. It's so realistic that people will actually go up to the painting and try to poke at the glass pane that's broken in the corner. This piece was held by the Berkshire Museum for years. You might have heard something about that. It is now in the collection of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which George Lucas is going to be opening a museum. He's one of the few people that could afford this painting because he did a small production called Star Wars a couple years ago. Did pretty well. So Rockwell has a great run in Arlington. Fantastic, top of his game. But he has to move. And why is he moving? Well, his psychiatrist, Eric Erickson, said he painted his happiness, he did not live it. And what does that mean? Well, simply put, there's a lot of things going on with everybody, with the background of his life. And I only feel free to talk about this because the family talks about it now. And ironically, the people in Arlington knew a lot of this background information but kept mum about it. So what am I talking about? Well, Mary Rockwell was getting getting ill, and she needed treatment down at Riggs, down in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And for her health, Norman, and this was one of the primary motivators, for her health, Norman decided that moving closer to the hospital would be best for her. Norman himself was also going psychiatric treatment. He battled depression for years. He was pretty upfront about that. I've read the letters in the archives that he was sending both to his doctor, to his friends, to his art editor. It was something that plagued him for years. And Rockwell's friends were moving away. John Atherton died at in 1952. 52? Don't hold me to that. Mead Schaefer moved away. So he was starting to feel a little bit isolated, I think. His artistic friends were moving away. He had a lot of friends in town, but these are the people that he moved here with. And honestly, he talks about this a little bit in his letters. Small town life was getting hard on him because he knew that Mary was so ill and he didn't want to put her out to the public like that, if that makes any sense. So he did move to moved to Stockbridge. He had continued success. He did this amazing piece, Family Tree, that shows that we're all a little bit of scoundrels. We come from scoundrels in America. That's something to be proud of. And he also did this amazing late career renaissance, the problem we all live with. He moved away from the Saturday Evening Post because, believe it or not, the art editors at the Saturday Evening Post started telling him what to do. And he did not react well to that. Could you imagine telling Norman Rockwell, well, I don't think you should paint that way. Maybe let it go. He also wanted to extol his virtues. He felt that it was time for him to show people what he believed in. And the problem we all live with is perhaps the most iconic piece that he ever produced. Certainly the most powerful and the most moving, about desegregation, focusing on Ruby Bridges' version of desegregating the school system down in the South. And as he aged out, he stopped painting around 72, 73, and passed away in 1978. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I didn't tell too many untruths. Thank you.
Okay, a very quick break, and we'll get set up for the next speakers. So we have a quick video clip here we'd like to show you, and we'll get started now.
I think when Norman left, it was perhaps the first time that the people in the town realized that Norman Rockwell had been there. Over the years, I have thought many, many times about what was this connection that I had with Norman Rockwell. It obviously was a big event in my life.
You know, the golden rule which says do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Some of them came from Stockbridge, right here in Stockbridge, and others came from Washington, Vermont. He is a Japanese student. I got over at the college in Vermont.
In our village, many, many people posed for Norman.
I see this group as the father and mother and child. They were Squire's family from Washington, Vermont.
It was not unusual to look at a Saturday Evening Post and be able to recognize many, many people.
He's a Yankee, and she's Swedish. And they got, I think, 12 kids.
And over the period that he was in the village, really, our town became the models for him.
I didn't get them all in the picture, but it's one of
When I went to the studio, Gene Pelham was there, who was his photographer, and Norman. He brought me into his whole creation. And generally, he had a little sketch, and he'd tell me the story about that sketch. I seemed to be a part of that, at least at the time. I felt that I I was an important part of this creation that was going on. And of course, I was drawn into it, and I was ready to go. For example, in the picture of the little girl with the black eye, well, he really set that one up. He said, look, you're victorious in this picture. You're the little girl who beat the boys. So when I sat down to do it, he literally got down on the floor, started pounding the floor with his hands, and kept saying, come on, come on, come on, with a smile, and just started cheering me on. And pretty soon I was just able to let go, and out came that marvelous rhythm.
You see, whenever there's a big idea that I'm trying to portray, I always use plain everyday people to express that.
He captured the American life, the way people were living life and going through life. He was reflecting that to people, and they loved it.
Thank you. And of course, we're so fortunate to have Mary Whalen join us this morning. She really needs no introduction. If you think about Norman Rockwell, you think about Mary Whalen. Thank you, Mary, for coming.
I think we got it?
I think so.
Okay. Hello, my friends from Arlington and from various places. I met somebody here from Maine this morning who came down from Augusta. So there are still people around who love Norman Rockwell. It's wonderful to be in Arlington, and I must say I can't stand here today without saying that 56 years ago, last Saturday, I stood here facing this wonderful young man and telling him I would spend the rest of my life with him. And so it is. And I'm happy that Phil and two of my daughters are here today with me. It is always a wonderful moment to remember Norman Rockwell. I was just a kid, as we say. We all can say that. And I hardly knew what was going on, to be perfectly honest. I can remember coming home from school one day, and my mother said to me, "Oh, your picture is on the post cover." And I said, "Oh." I didn't even take time to look at it. It just was just part of my life. So I didn't really let this moment of who Norman Rockwell was come to be real in my life until I was a young adult. And maybe the moment that it most struck was when I was driving my car in Tempe, Arizona, and I heard the word that Norman Rockwell had died. I stopped the car and started crying. And it was at that point that I began to say, who was Norman Rockwell? And what was this like for me? And maybe the person who taught me the most about Norman Rockwell was Buddy Edgerton. I think if you really want to get to know Norman as he was in Arlington, Vermont, read his book, The Unknown Rockwell. There's no pretense in the book. It isn't coming from the point of a view of an art critic, but it's talking about relationship and who Norman was to the Edgerton family. I don't think we really knew who Norman Rockwell was. He would appear in town. He'd come, might see him at the post office, but we have to go back to the 40s and the early 50s, which is when I met Norman. There wasn't a whole lot of communication. I'm thinking the Rockwell home is maybe, 5 to 7 miles from here. People were not traveling in and out of Arlington every day, if you lived in West Arlington. So the only time I ever remember seeing Norman in town was at the community lawn fair, the lawn party that took place on a Thursday night in August. And one year, for $1 as a fundraiser, anybody could sit, and George Hughes was there, Norman Rockwell was there. I'm thinking, Don, that your dad was there. And the other person was Vic Donahue, who came to town, lived here for maybe 5 or 6 years in the 50s, and he drew Hopalong Cassidy. Well, once television came in, comic books began to exit. And Vic Donahue basically lost his job. And he eventually left and went to Arizona and got into painting cowboys. And it just happened that I lived in Arizona and I had a chance to have dinner a couple of times with Vic and his lovely wife, Eileen. So Arlington was abuzz with artists, but they've pretty much lived their own lives. They worked hard. They were busy. I think that Norman spent most of his time in the studio working. I had an opportunity maybe 20 years ago to hear Peter Rockwell speak in Phoenix. There was an exhibit, a Rockwell exhibit going around the United States. And they invited Peter to come and give a lecture. And they also invited my husband and me to take Peter and his lovely wife out for dinner that night. And it was just a marvelous experience. I had never met Peter Rockwell. And at that time, he was still living in Rome, where he was a sculptor. And he told me 2 interesting bits of information that really went inside me and stayed. One was that the thing he was most grateful for in living in Arlington was that his dad would take him around and introduce him to the models. Maybe his dad was going to go ask somebody to pose. And Peter said, I learned to talk to ordinary people. And he said that served him very well because as a sculptor, he needed good marble. And when he would go to the quarries to talk about buying a piece of marble, he felt very comfortable talking to ordinary people. And maybe that's one of the things that Norman most saw in Arlington. We were ordinary people. We lived in a village. People worked hard. We interacted with each other. We helped each other. And as we well know, it was a much simpler life than what we have today. The other thing that Peter told me was that he remembered driving with his dad down to North Bennington to the bank. A lot of Arlington people went to the bank in North Bennington. And he said they would be going down for the purpose of getting a loan so they could live until the next painting was sold. So even though Rockwell was very well known, he was not a rich man when he lived in Arlington. He worked hard as an artist. So I have to say, I was part of the working hard. I enjoyed going to the studio. It was just a very enjoyable time. It was kind of, maybe it was an escape, but it was just filled with joy. And I felt part of that production. When I finished, I received my $5 and a Coke. And that was a magical moment. First of all, we were not allowed to drink Cokes at home, but Norman Rockwell could ring a buzzer. It took us a bit of time to figure that out. He had a little buzzer that went into the house, and Marie Briggs would come out with a tray of some Cokes, and we really thought we had made it. That was a big moment in our lives. So, I think, have I talked enough here? Don, are we ready to do the next thing?
Well, I think you wanted to say how you met Buddy.
Yeah, the next thing that I want to talk about is that I grew up in Arlington for 18 years, and I never met Buddy Edgerton. I knew of Buddy Edgerton because one does not look through a Rockwell book and not see Buddy Edgerton. So I was invited to, maybe coerced, to go to a function in Evansville, Indiana, and I resisted it. The first couple of times at the phone call, I was making excuses. And then this teacher prevailed. So it was a matter of going to a private school where this man taught, and he was working with his students and had produced a picture of the United Nations picture we saw, the photo we saw this morning. It's a mural that was put up in the United Nations. And then it morphed into the post cover. I didn't make the post cover, by the way. So I flew to Chicago, and then I went to a very small little terminal, and I was standing in the terminal waiting for my flight to Evansville, Indiana. And all of a sudden, I saw this man walking right towards me, and he came right up in front of me and he said, "Are you Mary Whalen?" And, suddenly I was transported back to Arlington, Vermont, and my mother was saying to me, don't speak to strangers. So I was kind of taken aback, and I said, meekly, yes, I am. And he said, hi, I'm Buddy Edgerton. Well, that was the introduction to Buddy and I spending a weekend together. We were strangers, but we got to know each other well. The first thing we did was, when the call came to get on the plane, we got on the plane. And the next thing we knew, we were getting off the plane. We'd gotten on the wrong plane. This one was going to Appleton, Wisconsin. So it really was wonderful because we just started laughing with each other. And of course, we got off the plane and we laughed all the more. Well, we found that we were going to have time together because on Friday we went to the school, but after school we were taken back to our hotel, so we had dinner together. And then the next morning we made arrangements that we'd go to the gym, and after the gym we would meet for breakfast. And it was like a 2-hour breakfast before we were picked up to go out to lunch with the teacher and his wife. So Buddy and I talked about Norman Rockwell in a way I never had talked before. And he just told me marvelous stories. I think what I most appreciated was that Buddy Edgerton was such a genuine person. He was thinking about writing a book, but he wanted to write the book from the perspective of what a wonderful gift it was in his life that Norman Rockwell came and lived next door. And how beautiful the Rockwells, Mary and Norman, how beautiful they were to the Edgerton family. And I do remember reading in Buddy's book that after Mary Rockwell died in 1959, Norman met Molly. I never met Molly, but before he was married, he came up surreptitiously, I might add, and he introduced Molly to Claire and Jim Edgerton. He wanted to make sure that he had their blessing before he married Molly. There was a deep, beautiful relationship. I found it very touching. And the other thing that happened that I remember with much gratitude is that at one point Buddy said to me, Mary, my father told me that your mother was the brightest woman he had ever met. Well, it turns out that in 1940, my mother was the chairperson of the school board. In 1940, Arlington High School burned, and my mother, along with Jim Edgerton, who was his buddy's dad, who was on the school board, they built that school. And it was very touching to me to think that here I am in the middle of Indiana and we're having this lovely talk about my mother. I deeply appreciated that. Well, the last thing in our conversation, which really opened up our wonderful time together, Buddy said to me, Mary, how come I didn't meet you? I didn't know you. And I said, Buddy, when did you graduate from high school? And he said, 1948. And I said, Buddy, that's the reason. I said, I went to first grade in 1948. So that was kind of, it captures my experience. I mean, we had a weekend together, we shared meals together, and we just talked and talked. And because of that, I was one of the people that Buddy would call and want to talk about Norman Rockwell. So the last 20 years, Buddy and I would have our buddy time, and it was wonderful. So Jim, I have to say to you that you have a father who was a prince. He was a magnificent man. And yes, my Rockwell experience was very, very wonderful, but getting to know Buddy Edgerton was pretty wonderful too.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay. Should I talk a little bit? So here is just a little collage.
Hi.
Hello. Chuck Marsh was a very good friend of mine. He was my twin brother's best friend, so I spent a lot of time with Chuck Marsh. And I have to admit that Chuck Marsh was my beau during high school. So, when this day in the life of a boy, on the left-hand side, when that came out, and I don't see a date, but I think it was about 52, 53, Norman, as he said to me later, when we did the day in the life of a girl, he said, Mary, if you had been here, if I had known you, you could have been that little girl. But I think this little girl did very well. It's just fine with me. The middle picture was the girl with the shiner. And many people have said to me, that's really who I was as growing up. I would like to think that I was a little more sophisticated, but alas, I wasn't. The cornflakes box, there were, I don't know, maybe four people my age. Chuck Marsh was one, and Michael Hess. I don't know if Michael Hess is here today. I haven't seen him. No. And we were on the Kellogg's cornflakes box. There's a nice picture of Chuck, and the thing about that picture is that Chuck was not an athlete. So I always would chide him about that. He didn't play baseball, but it's a good pose, I think. And then the girl, the day of the life of a girl, maybe point out something to you. The next to last picture, the little girl praying, that was not in the original design that Rockwell had finished with the charcoal. And yet, in the meantime, the day in the life of the boy had come out, and he was scolded. Norman was scolded by a lot of people that said, how come that little boy doesn't have time to pray at the end of the day? So, we were all done with the life of the girl, a day in the life of the girl, and we got a phone, my mother got a phone call and said, we've got to come down, Mary's got to come down, bring Mary down to West Arlington. And he said, bring the pajama top that she's wearing in the first and second picture, and we're going to insert another little pose. So when I got down there, he said, go put your pajama top on. I probably put it right on over my jersey. And he said to me, this is the only time he ever asked me to do a pose. He said, Mary, I don't know how a little girl poses, or prays, but you do. So he said, just get down here on your knees and do what you do every night when you say your prayers. I had to think about that. So anyhow, that's why that little picture is inserted. It's not that the little boy or the little girl is better, it's just that Norman didn't realize he needed to do that to please the American public. Okay? I think, here are a couple more photographs. You can see above in the, that was a red check shirt I had. I love that shirt. And he made it green and white. And when the cover came out, I said to myself, how come he didn't make it red? Had to let go. So anyhow, that's Chuck Marsh was on the bicycle seat and I was on the bar and he was holding my braids out. And I think if you go to the picture, you'll see over here, 1, 2, 3 down on the left, the pigtails are straight out. Norman was very precise in what he wanted. And the bottom picture is a picture of my mother and me. She's holding me up. As I recall, there was just a board there, maybe in between 2 chairs. It was a very primitive structure for the bed. And I'm waking up. I remember I arrived at the studio that morning with my hair in perfect braids. Nothing was out of place. And the first thing Norman said to my mother was, Margaret, mess up Mary's hair. So, a little tussle. And the third picture, actually that photo wasn't used. It instead goes back to just before the party picture, and I'm working on my braid, on my ribbon. That was the original idea, to have a little mirror. And the dress in that picture, Norman went to Bennington to get the party dress he wanted. My mother had brought 2 or 3 dresses with me, but they just weren't perfect. So there was a children's shop in Bennington, up, I think, on the way to Woodford. Is it Woodford Mountain? Yeah. There was a little children's shop, and he went down there, and he bought that dress for me, and a 2-piece bathing suit, which I had never worn before. And that was a little scary for me, but we got through it. And so that bathing suit, that yellow bathing suit and that dress were gifts from Norman to me. He was sweet. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Melinda Pelham. May I call you Chick? You have been known to me as Chick for a long, long time. Thank you for coming and visiting. This is Jean Pelham's daughter, and come on up to the...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if you can hear me now. I don't know if you'll be able to hear me later.
Now is when it counts.
It does.
Yep, take your time.
Well, good afternoon. It's delightful to see all of you here today. And it's wonderful to be back in Arlington. I love this community. I have loved it since the very beginning of my life, and I've left it and lived many other places, but it's always home. When I come back to Arlington, I always feel like I've come home. A lot of you probably already know some of my dad's story, and I'll sort of start with that, on how my dad got to Arlington and why I grew up here. Dad was an artist before he came to Arlington. He had gone to art school in New York City. He went to Grand Central School of Art and also the National Academy of Design, as did Norman Rockwell. And after the Depression, well, his dad died in 1936 and he was left living with his mom. And after the Depression and after the death of his father, I think things were looking pretty scarce and sparse, and his cousin, Artie Wood, had moved to Arlington and encouraged my father and my grandmother to move up here. They said, you know, there are other artists up here. I don't know if he knew exactly who they were, but they decided to make the move, and they met up with Bert Inman, who is Mary Inman Hall's dad, and Mary's here today. He was the real estate broker, could easily have been Rockwell's broker, I'm not sure. But they looked around and found a little house down on Route 313 that was in pretty bad state, but they bought it and some acreage and started to renovate to make it livable. And during that time, I guess Norman was looking for somebody to help him with studio settings, and he needed a carpenter. And my dad was out working on the house, and Norman thought Dad was a carpenter. So he pulled down into the yard and said, excuse me, I think Dad was up on a ladder, according to the story I was told. You know, are you a carpenter? Could you help me with some work that I need done? And my father turned around and looked at him and he said, what the hell are you doing here? And Norman looked up at him and he said, well, what the hell are you doing here? The fact of the matter was that they had both lived in New Rochelle and known each other. They were a member of the same country club, and my dad had posed for Norman when he was a young boy, starting with some young men from New Rochelle saying Norman was out looking for models and he needed a pudgy kid, and some of Dad's friends said, well, we know just the kid for you to paint. And they went and got my dad, and sure enough, that was the beginning of the relationship for my dad and Norman Rockwell. And this painting here was for Western Electric, I think it is. And I had always wondered what painting Dad was in, and Dad never really talked about his years modeling for Norman. We just knew that he had done it. And quite recently, I was doing an audio tape of my father many years ago, and he had described, he was sitting in a bed, had a quilt, he was sitting by a window. He didn't say that he was eating crackers, because this is called Crackers in Bed, but he said he was supposed to be sick, and so I had never seen that painting, and this showed up on the Rockwell Facebook page, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that is Dad. I have pictures of my father that look just like that at the age Dad would have been. And my family members, some of them don't think it's him because he has red hair, but we all know that Norman painted red hair on children when he wanted their hair color to change, because red bounced off the page and made the painting more effective. So I'm really quite sure that that is the painting or one of the paintings that Dad posed for. Well, back to West Arlington, after they had reunited and Norman explained to him what he needed, my dad also was a photographer. He'd studied photography during his years at school, and they were able to realize that Dad could be an assistant to Norman, and that's where that 14-year relationship began. And my father was his photographer, he was his assistant, he was his good friend. When my dad met Mom, they were married. Norman was their best man. So we were pretty intricately involved with the Rockwell family. Tommy Rockwell used to babysit for us, and I used to ride piggyback and pull his ears and tell him which way I wanted to go. And I'm sure he doesn't remember that, and it's perfectly all right. But I was, very young, and I did start modeling for Norman. I think I was probably just a few months old, and we will get to that. But my father admired Norman hugely. He was devoted to him for those 14 years. And Dad did do his own painting in that span of time, but he spent most of those 14 years doing work with Norman. He would find him models, he would find him props, he would make him props. He would use our household objects as props. He would just do whatever Norman needed him to do. He painted the Japanese flag that's in the garage scene. He would take my grandmother's furniture and clock are featured in the first April Fool's post cover that has so many silly little things in it, you really have to look for them all. I think there are maybe 18 or something things that are oddball. And I often think that Dad's sense of humor very often featured in Norman's work in Arlington, because Dad had a very quirky sense of humor, and so did Norman. And I think the two of them would just toss things back and forth and figure out, how these paintings were going to be presented. And that is a portrait that my father did of Norman Rockwell. And I think it really is the best portrait that my father ever painted, and he painted quite a few portraits. But I think he really wanted it to be perfect because it was a portrait of the man that he admired. And that painting is now down at the Stockbridge Museum. I don't know if it's on display. And they've taken the frame that was originally on it off. But I still think it's one of my father's finest pieces of work. So that's how they got together. And after that, let's see, what's the next? Yes, we get into the landscape and the Edgerton years. My dad also did Christmas cards, and he did a series of 7 back in the 50s. And the Edgerton family features very prominently in all of Dad's Christmas cards. That red sled and Jim and Clara are in every one of Dad's Christmas cards. So the Edgertons started posing for my father for a variety of different reasons, and Dad also used a lot of other of the artists in town. They all kind of fed off of each other and used each other, family members. I know we posed for the Hugheses, Mom and Dad, and me for a post cover that George Hughes did. And the Edgertons were close neighbors. They lived probably not even 3 miles away. We grew up on their maple syrup. It was the best maple syrup ever. You still can't find any to beat it. And we just enjoyed going to the church suppers down in the Green and living in West Arlington, and Norman was always around and the Edgertons were always around. But I never met Buddy until the babysitter, Save the Babysitter slide. Is that the next slide? Oh no, that's me, sorry. Backing up to the Christmas cards. So Dad did Christmas cards, but so did Norman. And he did a series for Hallmark cards. And this particular one in this little page shows all of the different iterations. You can look at this if you're around later. But the image, the final image, I meet myself all over the world with this image because somehow it got on record covers, catalog covers, CD covers, calendars. I mean, everywhere I go, I have seen this image. And I didn't even realize it at the time that I was going to be on a Christmas card. It was kind of like what Mary Whalen was saying. We just did it. We didn't think about it. Posing was just something that we did. And I was in Norman's studio a lot because I posed for him quite a few times for a variety of different things. And his wife would always, Mary, was always the one that would come and take me out and give me a break and take me up into the house for probably a bathroom break and some ice cream. And and this is Don Trachty and me posing for another one of the Hallmark cards. And we're in our pajamas, and I'm talking out of school here when Don told me probably 10 years ago that he was very embarrassed to be in this picture with me in his pajamas. And I'm sure I wasn't even thinking about it. I don't know that it mattered to me, but I love that one. And that's Don Trachty Sr., and that's my dad. And my dad turned out to be the Santa in the previous Christmas card that you saw. He's the one peeking around the chair. He's very prominent in many of Norman Rockwell's paintings. You can, if you look carefully, you can see that it's my dad. And that's my father's cover for Coronet. That's our Siamese cat sitting on the stool. Those are my mom's shoes and her vacuum. And I always thought that was her. Now I'm not quite so sure because I think it might be Dr. O'Neill's wife. But I really have to get some better pictures of that to make that determination. So I'm not really sure if that's my mom or not, but my mom was in a lot of different pictures too. And here comes Buddy. Oh my gosh. So how I met Buddy Edgerton is related to the babysitter, but my dad used Buddy for a model as well. And in this particular painting, he has Buddy up in Maine because we never went on vacations. The only vacation that I ever remember was Dad wanted to take pictures, photographs of the Maine coast. And so we went to Pemaquid Beach, Maine, and to New Harbor, Maine, and we had never seen the ocean. It was my sister and me. I don't know, my brother's here. You can ask him later if he remembers going to Maine with us. I'm not sure he was in the picture yet. But he had taken all of these different photographs of little fishing villages, and I guess he needed a model for the fishermen. So when he got back to Arlington, he used Buddy, obviously, and he had him all geared up like he was going fishing. So that is the photograph, that is the drawing, and then this is the final, this is the color sketch, and Buddy's gone. He painted him out, which I think was a darn shame, because Buddy Edgerton was GQ gorgeous. I mean, I don't know why he would ever think to take him out of there. Oh my gosh. When I found that photograph, I'm like, who is this? And then I thought, darn, I wish I hadn't been that young when Buddy was around. He was really handsome. But I didn't meet Buddy until the 90s when the babysitter was going to be, it had, well, there's a story about that. Do I have time to tell the story? Sure. apparently, this painting of the babysitter was given to the class, a certain class in Burlington, Vermont, because they had gone down to see Norman at work in his studio. It was a big day. They took the bus down, they took the bus back, and they'd had a wonderful time, and they loved Norman. He was really wonderful to children. He listened to them, and he was always looking for a new model, probably. So anyway, one of the young women in that class got leukemia and sadly died. And so the class took up a collection. It was a very modest amount of money, but they sent it down to Norman and they said, could you possibly send us something in memory of her, because we had such a wonderful trip and such a wonderful memory. Well, he sent back the money, which was typical of Norman, and he also sent the painting of the babysitter to that class. And it stayed in the Burlington school system for years and years, hanging in various places. And it was in the janitor's room, it was in the basement behind the furnace. I mean, it just, nobody was really enamored of this painting. It was just something that they'd always had for years and years. Finally, when I think it was, one of his paintings got sold for a couple of $1 million, and they realized that maybe they had something there, and the hard times were on the Burlington school system, and the school board decided they could use the money, forget the painting. So they were going to sell it. Well, there were enough class members around to say, this is our painting, this belongs in Burlington, we want it here. And so they did a campaign, Save the Babysitter, and that's when I met Buddy Edgerton, because he called me. And he said, you were the baby and the babysitter, right? And I said, yeah, I was. And he said, well, we're trying to save it up here in Burlington. Would you get involved? And I said, of course I would. So we had many fundraisers over the course of a couple of years. I know that Lucille Town, who's also here in the audience today, she was the one who ultimately was painted into the painting, but that is artist Edgerton. She was my real babysitter, and she's holding me, and in the shadow you can see my mom, and I'm looking at her desperately because I'm crying my eyes out. And when my mom was, during her final days and I was visiting her, all of a sudden, out of the blue, she's like, you know, I always felt bad about that. And I said, about what, Mom? She said, well, you know that painting of the babysitter? And I'm like, yeah. She said, well, you wouldn't cry. And they were pinching you and they were trying to make you cry, and you wouldn't cry. And so she said, ultimately what happened was they got a pin and they pricked your feet, and that made you cry. And she said, I felt bad about it ever since. But I didn't know, I certainly didn't feel it. And so the end result was that there's a pin in real life in that painting. We raised enough money to save it. It now hangs in the Fleming Museum at UVM. And the pin in that diaper is a real pin. Norman stuck it through the painting, and it's part of the painting. And I swear, if somebody did some DNA on that, it could possibly be the pin that pricked my feet. Now, I'm just saying, I don't know for sure about that. And this was me posing for something else. I have multiple pictures of me and Norman, me doing all kinds of variety of things, some of which never saw the light of day. And another one that never saw the light of day was that I posed along with Mary Whalen for the Kellogg's Cornflakes box. And I was not chosen. My brother and I were the first two to be sent out to Kellogg's. And my brother was wearing a little blue shirt and I have a little pink blouse. And Kellogg's sent them back and they said, nope, this won't do. We don't want blue eyes and blonde hair. We want red hair and freckles. And so I was not chosen. However, I got the painting. So I feel like I was the lucky one. I might not have gotten on the Kellogg's cornflake box, but I did get a painting of myself done by Norman Rockwell. So what you're seeing here are some of my dad's landscapes. When Norman left, it was very sudden. My dad didn't know, the Edgertons didn't know, from what I've heard. He didn't tell anybody. He just backed up the moving truck and moved out of town. And of course, this was our bread and butter. So he was gone. I think my father went into a very depressed period of time in his life. I don't really think he ever got over it, but he did move on to try a variety of different things, and of course he continued painting. He had several paintings where they were made into prints, and he had some royalties from that. He opened he did some post covers. Actually, I think those were while Norman was still working with Norman. And Norman didn't give him much time. I think that's why there's only 2. Because during those years that he worked for Norman, he was at his beck and call every waking hour. He would call him at night, he would call him early in the morning, he would call him on weekends. He called him on Christmas Day. On Christmas Day, when we were very young, he called and said, "Gene, I need you to come down." And my father's like, "Norm, it's Christmas Day, I'm not coming." And Norman said, "Well, I really need you." And Dad said, "Well, Christmas is very special in our family, and, you know, I'm sorry, but I just can't make it today." And then apparently he sent Mary Rockwell up to bang on the door and say, "Gene, Norman really needs you." And I think it was the only time that my father ever refused Norman Rockwell. But his Christmas Day was special to him. So I think that's about the end of my synopsis, my early memories. I was so young at the time that there's a lot that I've forgotten, but it certainly was a privilege to be a model for Norman Rockwell, and it was also a privilege to live in West Arlington with the Edgertons and all of the other wonderful people in that community and in the whole town. I did not realize that I had grown up in basically a Norman Rockwell painting until much later in my life. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we're only running about an hour late. Sorry about that. But I want to have Steve Haggerty step up, and we have some slides. He'll go through, and then we can break and all gather next door, have food, and so on. But Steve is a local author, and I think his uniqueness was there's been a million books written about Norman Rockwell, but in Steve's case, he's written about the models, and that's unique. Steve.
Okay.
Do you want me to advance slides?
Well, it's a privilege to be up here, and thank you.
Yes.
I grew up in the Connecticut suburbs, but spent 3 months a year here in Arlington, and I actually went to this church, like Mary Whalen. I remember it very well. There was a priest named Father Buckley, and he was a very dynamic man, and he got all over town because every time I mention that, somebody says, "Oh, he was on the volunteer ambulance corps as the chaplain," or else he was at the hunting camp, you know, all over the place. So anyway, but we spent 3 months a year in Vermont because my father was working with Richard Rogers and Hammerstein, and he could do the work in our place in Sandgate, which is part of the West Arlington community. So here's how I got my start. I'm in the blue sweatshirt, and the man there is Richard Schroll, which some people who've been around here might remember. I worked with him on the first farm I worked on in Sandgate for a man named Millard Smith, and then came and worked for Charlie Bentley in West Arlington, right across from the Wayside store. And got to know Marie Briggs really well because she was the Rockwell's cook and housekeeper. She's in that United Nations painting. And so anyway, we get done with working on the farm and go over to Floyd Bentley's house, who's in one of the slides, and have dinner at lunchtime, and it was delicious. People would say it was worth working for Charlie on the farm just to go have lunch that Marie made. And here is Floyd Bentley, worked on the farm of him and his cousin Charlie, as I said. And this is the sight we would see. We would be driving down the road, and he would be cutting the side of the road with these horses, just like that. My father said one time, you know, take a good look at this. You'll never see anything like that again. However, I think his cousin who ran the farm, you know, would get a little annoyed because when Floyd went somewhere, he would often take the horses, and they would say it took him as long to hitch up the horses. He could have been there and back by the time he hitched them up. But it was a great, great sight to see. And we saw this painting earlier, so this is Floyd in Breaking Home Ties. It's very authentic because Floyd was a melancholy sort of guy, a wonderful gentleman. He was a horse whisperer, and just great with the horses. But he was always kind of sad. People said it was because, well, his cousin told me it was because his mother and father both died in 1929, you know, 1 week apart. And so he was a sensitive guy, and that kind of, you know, made him more sensitive. And he also had to sell the house that he and his brother had just bought. So anyway, I started working on the book, and I got to go to Don's father's studio and see the famous wall where that Breaking Home Ties was hiding, up in Sandgate. And Don asked me to write the book, and part of it was he thought I had a keen understanding in one of my poems how when it's raining or even drizzling, the cows huddle under a tree and they do not want to come down. So I showed that very clearly and talked about how I used to have to chase the cows down. And it started in Sandgate that I got paid, I think it was $0.10 to chase the cows in from the field right in front of the barn, and 25 cents to chase them down from the mountain. And I guess 25 cents would be a couple bucks now, so. And there I am. When I worked on this, I met a lot of the models. Really wonderful to hear the stories. And I got to work in Norman's studio writing the book for a couple days. And that was really special. It's very much like it was, now called Rockwell's Retreat. And the cut marks from Norman and Jean cutting mats are still on the floor there. So very much like it was. And I expected to see him, you know, walk out, you know, at any minute and say hello to him. Maybe if I kept writing a few more days, I would have. Okay, so this is my book, Norman Rockwell's Models, In and Out of the Studio, and it was published by Rowman and Littlefield. And it's doing very well. The downloads seem to sell a lot. People like the ebook on downloads a lot. And just really had a good time with it. You can see on the cover up top is Mary Whalen, and below her is Chuck Marsh, and at the bottom is Don Hubert Jr., who's in the famous Say and Grace painting. And I was fortunate to get good reviews in USA Today and Publishers Weekly, And there's an interview on NPR I did. That was really a lot of fun with Joe Donahue, who lives in Cambridge. And then another pretty new newspaper, I guess, called Epoch Times. And I've been up to see Jarvis Rockwell probably 6 or 8 times. And, you know, he's a warm, wonderful guy. Really enjoy him. He'll be 93, I think, on September 5th. But he's still got all his marbles very sharp. And so he gave me his collection of home photos. He gave them to me, about 50 of them. And I called up his I guess his niece, yeah, it would be his niece, and asked if I could, you know, use some of them in the book, but I mainly want to know if they had been seen before. And she said, no, but you should give them back. So I had them, and I knew, you know, that I should, so I gave them back, but he let me use them for the book and for presentations. So, in 1933, Norman was living in New Rochelle, New York, and I happen to work now in New Rochelle, New York. Did meet a guy a couple years ago who was like 92, and he said, oh, I remember Norman walking around here. That was pretty neat. And so there they are in 1933, Norman on the right, Mary in the middle, and on the left is Mrs. Rockwell. She appears in the painting Freedom from Want, the Thanksgiving picture. And there's young Jarvis and Tom in front. And this photo was in the collection. That's the house on River Road that it's still there. It looks pretty much the same. You can see the studio. That's the one that burned down in 1933. And it's right along the Battenkill River. You can see the river going by. So Norman could paint there and just look out at the river. And I know it was said before, but excuse me, when that studio burned down, it gave him a chance to start new. Okay, my voice back. Okay, thanks. All right, so here's Norman and Mary, and Mary's sister, Norman's mother-in-law, and his mother first, and his in-laws. And in the front, you can see Tom and Jarvis in the middle, and Peter, and the dog, Rally. And that's right in at the same house in West Arlington. And on the left is something that Jarvis wasn't too keen on, because look at that jacket. Could you imagine your father walking around town in that jacket? But Norman wanted to be really down to earth. He did get away from hanging around like with F. Scott Fitzgerald and in the New Rochelle area, because he, you know, he was living some of the excesses of the party life, and he didn't want to get totally consumed. So he stepped back, and then when he got up here, he was pretty much in with a new crowd of people. You know, although, you know, to say for New Rochelle, he really liked it there. He did a whole bunch of great paintings, but he really, like people said, wanted to settle down here. Okay. Oh, and there's Buddy. I really enjoyed getting together with Buddy a whole bunch of times. He did love to talk about Rockwell, and he wanted people to carry it on. So he was willing to tell me all about the models and, you know, all these details I never would have gotten anywhere else. You know, and like people said, he was a very, you know, kind, considerate person. And I could see him maybe having pause about writing the book, because in West Arlington, people didn't talk about each other a lot. In fact, Charlie, whose cousin was Floyd in Breaking Home Ties, he used to tell me, never say anything bad about the dead. And, you know, growing up, I used to think, how could I ever be a writer if I can't say anything bad about the dead? But that's, you know, how they were out there. So when I wrote this book, I was really careful. And this is called The Guiding Hand, and there is, Buddy, and on the left is Tom Rockwell. And, they were really best buddies, hung around together all the time, and, camping and fishing. And Norman liked it because, he had a good, mentor for his son. And Tom liked it because Tom was a real outdoors sort of guy, hunting, fishing, and camping. And he was also a basketball star in Arlington. And we see again the Rockwell home on the right and the Edgerton home on the left. On the right, it's now Rockwell's Retreat, a great place to stay. And I also spent a lot of time on the Village Green growing up, swimming and dancing and so forth. So there's our red covered bridge, and we used to jump off it. You can't do that now because the water's not deep enough, but we used to climb right up and jump off. And Norman used to square dance in the pavilion there. He really loved that, except he was afraid that one of the Husky country ladies was going to swing him off his feet. And I got this from Buddy Edgerton's daughter, Joy. And, he looks like a movie star there. Very handsome fellow again. Okay, in the center is Buddy's daughter, Artis. And I spent a week with her in Florida. She was really she is a wonderful person. Now at 90 years old. And by the way, on the left is Billy Brown, and he became an excavator in town. But in the next slide, Artis, Artis really felt like she was a movie star. And so this was really thrilling for her. And there is Jarvis and Artis and myself at the at a Rockwell reunion. And in March, I went to see Jarvis again, and he really, endorsed my book. He's really interesting to be around because he knows all the details and the paintings. And, to go through a book of paintings with him is really special. And like I said, he's 92 and very sharp, a warm, wonderful guy, and really a big help to his father. People wouldn't always realize helping his father and being in paintings, was, he really did a lot. And there I am with Peter Rockwell. Buddy Edgerton set that up for me to meet Peter in Beverly, Mass. So I, drove up there and spent a day with him. And, they're all very down-to-earth people, so it was really nice. Okay, and I give a free one of my poetry books that has the cows coming down from the mountain after I chase them down. So, who was a male model that appeared in paintings in New Rochelle, West Arlington, and Stockbridge? Okay. Okay, does anybody, well, I should ask the question before, went too far, but it's Tom Rockwell. Okay. So that's a 1936 New Rochelle painting. And he's also in Christmas Homecoming in 1947 with a plaid shirt. And then again in 1959 in The Graduate. And that was a tough year to graduate because there was a lot going on. As you can see in the newspaper, Khrushchev warns of, war, atomic war, and the draft was extended. And, you know, there's job woes, so it was, you know, a tough time to graduate, and I think that's, oh yeah. So I went and met Tom, and the reason I was able to see him, he didn't want to be interviewed, but Buddy Edgerton called him, and he said a friend of Buddy's is a friend of mine. So I got together with him like 4 times, and twice was coincidentally in Poughkeepsie, New York. I went to Dunkin' Donuts, and there was Tom. So just, you know, serendipitously. And really a great guy. He's about 90 now, maybe even 91. If anybody doesn't know, he wrote a book called How to Eat Fried Worms, and that sold 3 million copies. And to this day, he makes maybe like $15,000 a year off that book. And I guess that's it.
Thank you very much. So, and Steve has his books for sale in the next door, and just don't spill hot dog relish on them, and he'll sign them for you. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and please feel free to wander and go next door, and there's plenty to exhibit, and hopefully there's some food over there. Thank you.